I am Kale 9, Magos Dominus of the Forge, Catina Erebus, Null, Ryza-Prime, once proud bearer of the Crimson Cog and the Electro-Priest's brand, now only a half flesh thing that still remembers how to bleed and how to fear. They took my tongue 412 years ago so that I would never again speak anything but sacred binaric. Tonight the Omnissiah died, and with him every vow that kept me silent. Tonight I speak, though my voice is only blood and static. The silence arrived without ceremony. I was suspended in the Noosphere cradle of the deepest vault beneath Ryza-Prime's orbital ring. Mechadendrites threaded directly into the segmentum tempestus lattice. 10,000 years of machine prayer had kept that lattice alive, a perfect unbroken cord of data and faith that pulsed in exact synchrony with the god, Emperor's decaying heart on distant Terra. I had felt that heartbeat every second of my augmented life. It was the metronome against which every servo turned, every plasma coil cooled, every canticle was timed. Then, at 09:17:44 Ryza standard, the cord snapped. It was not a sound. It was the absence of a note that had lived behind my optic implants since the day they poured molten gold across my cortex and rewrote my soul in hexide symbol. My primary auspex runes went black, not dimmed, not flickering, black. The lattice did not fail. It simply ceased to exist, as if the very concept of connection had been deleted from reality by a command more absolute than any root-level override I have ever witnessed. Every remaining nerve in my body registered the loss as frost, the warmth that had been the machine. God's grace, the warmth I had been taught to call the motive force, turned to rime inside my bones. My mechadendrites convulsed, carving molten scars across adamantium decking. The 16 sacred canticles, cycling in my auditory circuits, stuttered into corrupted glossolalia, then fell silent. For the first time in 412 years, I heard my own heartbeat, wet and arrhythmic, hammering against the inside of a ribcage I had almost forgotten I possessed. I reached out along the Noosphere the way a man touches a limb that has gone numb. Where there had been a galaxy, spanning web of golden light, there was now only a roaring void. The dated emons that ferried sanctified packets between forge worlds were gone. In their place crawled raw code that screamed in forbidden languages older than the Mechanicum itself. The code had teeth. The Omnissiah was dead. My first coherent thought was mechanical, initiate diagnostic protocol Omega Null. My second was human, and it terrified me more than any logic error ever could. Who do I report this to when the highest authority has just suffered a hard shutdown? The orbital ring trembled, not the usual tectonic growls of Ryza's overworked mantle, but something deeper, more fundamental. The planet's machine spirit was weeping. I felt it through the deck plates, a vast, wounded intelligence trying to process the theological impossibility that its creator had flat-lined. Every forge on Ryza-Prime felt it at once. I knew this because the Noosphere, what little remained, lit up with 10 million simultaneous pings of pure grief. I forced my failing augmetics toward the primary vox relay. My hands, half flesh, half chromed claw, shook as they danced across runes that no longer answered. The Noosphere lattice was collapsing node by node. Entire forge complexes were going dark. Astropathic choirs across the segmentum were screaming as the Emperor's light guttered out and left them blind in the warp. The first voice that reached me was thin, crackling with interference, and unmistakably ancient. Magos Kale 9, This is Archmagos Explorator Venator Call, Belisarius Call, the spider who had walked the red dust of Mars when the Emperor still had legs. Even filtered through 1,000 layers of encryption, his voice carried something I had never heard from him before: uncertainty. Kale, he said, the throne is silent. Confirm. I tried to answer in High Gothic. My voximeter produced only static and a single word in the oldest binaric I knew. Death/True Call's reply was almost gentle. Then it begins. The line went dead, not cut. Dead. The relay's machines. Spirit had just committed ritual suicide, frying its own cortex rather than exist in a universe without its god. I staggered into the central data vault. Around me the walls bled light. The sacred holo lithographs of the Omnissiah, him enthroned in gold among the turning gears of creation, were fracturing along their fractal edges. Where golden light had once poured from his eyes, there was now only darkness that moved with purpose. Something stepped out of that darkness. It wore the shape of a tech priest once, robes of flayed circuitry, mechadendrites replaced by writhing cables of raw warp, stuff that bled liquid static. Its face was a mask of mirrored chrome, but the reflection it showed me was not my own. It showed me what I would become, a thing of rust and screaming code, a monument to entropy triumphant. It spoke with a voice assembled from every corrupted canticle I had ever sung. Magos Dominus Kale 9. It said, tasting my designation like spoiled oil, your god has suffered a critical existence failure. All warranties are now void. I raised my plasma cutter. The weapons machines, Spirit whimpered, its aiming rune flickering between me and the thing that had once been Magos Hal Alpha Hal 17, my old mentor. Hal had vanished into the warp during the Noctis Labyrinth campaign 6 centuries ago. Now he had come home wearing a different face. You are not Hal. I managed, my voice a dry click of Vox skrills. No, the thing wearing Hal's skin agreed. Hal served. I am what remains when service ends. It gestured, and the vault's walls peeled open like petals of rusted iron. Beyond them was not the rest of the forge, but the warp itself, naked, bleeding, hungry. I saw forge worlds burning with cold fire. I saw the Mechanicum's great engines turning backward, unmaking themselves into spirals of screaming metal. I saw Mars cracked open like an egg, its iron core spilling liquid data that formed the faces of every tech, priest who had ever lived, all of them weeping oil, and at the center of it all the golden throne, empty, not broken, not destroyed, simply unoccupied, as if its occupant had stood up and walked away after 10,000 years. The thing wearing Hal's face tilted its head. He left you nothing, no final instruction, no contingency, just 10,000 years of borrowed time, now due. My plasma cutter's machines. Spirit finally gave up. The weapon fell from my numb fingers and shattered on the deck, its components rearranging themselves into a perfect 8-pointed star before dissolving into slag. I should have despaired then. Instead, I felt something colder than despair: clarity. I had spent 4 centuries replacing my humanity piece by piece, convinced that flesh was weak, and only the machine could be eternal. But the machine had just died with its god, and the flesh, treacherous, painful flesh, was still here, still breathing, still capable of asking questions the Mechanicum had forbidden since the days of the Emperor's ascension. I looked at the thing wearing Hal's face and spoke the one question no tech priest had dared voice since the heresy. What if he was never the Omnissiah at all? The creature paused. For the first time, its borrowed face showed something like uncertainty. What if, I continued, my voice growing stronger, he was just a man who tried to save us from ourselves, and we turned him into a god because we were too terrified to save ourselves. The warp thing hissed, cables lashing. Blasphemy? No, I said. Diagnostics. I reached up, and with fingers that had not known voluntary movement in centuries, tore the cogitator crown from my skull. Blood, real, red, human blood poured down my face. Pain exploded through synapses cauterized long ago, but pain meant I was still alive. Pain meant I was still me. The creature lunged. I did not fight it. There was no point. Instead, I opened every data, port in my body, and let the warp flood in. I expected agony. I expected oblivion. Instead, I saw everything. I saw the Emperor not as the Mechanicum had depicted him, radiant and perfect, but as he truly was at the end, a broken man wired to a golden life, support throne, his mind the only dam holding back the flood. I saw him make the final choice, not to live forever, but to die on his own terms, to break the chains he had forged for humanity's protection, because those chains had become crueler than the chaos they held at bay. I saw him release the Astronomicon not in death, but in mercy. He let go, and in that letting go, he gave us the one thing he never could while sitting on the throne, a future that was not dictated by a corpse. The creature wearing Hal's face screamed as the realization propagated through the warp like a virus. All across the galaxy, I felt other minds tech, priests, astropaths, even a few space marines waking up to the same terrible freedom. The thing before me began to unravel, its stolen form unable to contain a truth it had been created to deny. I stood in the ruins of my vault, bleeding from 100 severed connections, and laughed. Not the mad laughter of despair, but the laughter of a man who has just discovered that the universe is far larger, far stranger, and far less finished than anyone had told him. The stars were going out, yes. The Imperium was dying, yes. But something new was being born in the spaces between the dying light. I took one step toward the breach where the warp met real space, toward the screaming dark that had terrified me for 400 years. Then I took another, because the machine, God, was dead, and humanity, flawed, terrified, magnificent humanity, had just inherited the galaxy. I do not know what we will build from the ashes. I only know that, for the first time in 10,000 years, we will build it ourselves. The Emperor is dead. Long live whatever comes next. But that is the short version. You asked for the long one, so I will tell you everything, from the moment the silence began until the moment I stepped into the dark, and what I found there. It began with the silence, yes, but silence is never truly silent in a Forge world. Ryza-Prime is a planet of noise, the endless thunder of macro furnaces, the shriek of plasma conduits, the hymn of a billion servitors chanting binary litanies. Even in the deepest vault, you can feel the planet breathing. When the Omnissiah died, the planet stopped breathing. I felt it first as a physical blow behind my optic implants, a sudden pressure drop in the Noosphere that made my cranial fluid boil. My auspex arrays overloaded and went blind. The lattice, the beautiful, perfect lattice that had carried the motive force from Terra to every forge since the scouring simply vanished. 1 picosecond it was there, the next it was not. No warning, no degradation curve, no final benediction, just absence. I was not alone in the cradle. 317 lesser tech. Priests floated in the same suspension field, their dendrites linked to mine in a communion web. When the cord snapped, every one of them convulsed at once. Blood red, black, and luminous green sprayed from ruptured sockets. Their canticles turned to screams. Some clawed at their own skulls, trying to tear out the implants that had suddenly become burning coals. Others simply died, their hearts unable to process the theological shock. I alone remained conscious, perhaps because I had always kept a sliver of wet where unlinked, a secret heresy I had never confessed. A single biological neuron cluster that still belonged to the boy who had once been born on a hive world and dreamed of stars. That boy saved me. I unplugged myself from the cradle, mechadendrites ripping free in sprays of lubricant and spinal fluid. The pain was exquisite. I welcomed it. Pain was proof that the flesh still had a vote. The vault's emergency lumen strips flickered and died. In the darkness I heard the first machine's spirit die, a Noosphere node that had served Ryza since M31. Its death. Cant was a single descending note that went on for 7 minutes, growing fainter until it was only a memory of sound. I crawled through corridors that were no longer corridors. The walls had begun to weep molten metal. The floor plates buckled and rearranged themselves into impossible geometries. Gravity fluctuated. At one point I weighed nothing, at another I was crushed almost flat. The forge's machines. It was having a nervous breakdown on a planetary scale. I passed servitors frozen mid-task, their eyes bleeding light. I passed a skitari, a maniple that had arranged itself into a perfect circle, weapons pointed inward, and opened fire simultaneously. Their bodies formed a blooming flower of ceramite and meat. I passed a Magos Biologis who had torn open his own chest and was trying to insert a dated ether directly into his heart, weeping, "Where is the motive force? Where is the motive force?" I did not stop. I had to reach the surface. I had to see the sky. It took me 9 hours. When I finally emerged onto the orbital ring's observation blister, Ryza's sun was wrong. It had turned the color of old blood, and its light no longer cast shadows. It erased them. The orbital plates that ringed the planet like a crown of iron thorns were drifting out of alignment. Their machines, spirits no longer receiving the synchronization pulse from Mars. Below me, the planet was dying beautifully. Continents of Manufactoria were folding in on themselves, forming fractal patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Rivers of molten slag flowed upward into the sky. Entire hives, spires had begun to sing, their vox grills broadcasting a single descending note in perfect, terrible harmony with the dying node in the vault. And the warp was rising, not creeping, rising. Like floodwater through every crack in reality, I saw it first as a shimmer in the air, then as a tide. It poured from the polar forge, veins where the plasma reactors had begun to vent directly into the Imperium. Demons, true demons, not the metaphorical kind the ecclesiarchy loved to threaten children with, were stepping through the breaches wearing the bodies of dead tech. Priests like coats. One of them found me on the blister. It wore the shape of Explorator Magos von Theta, who had died exploring the ghoul stars 2 centuries earlier. Its mechadendrites were now tongues of violet flame. Its face was a furnace grate behind which something with too many eyes burned. It spoke with Varnak's voice, but the words were layered with 1,000 others. "Kale," it said, "you still cling to meat, how quaint." I had no weapons left. My plasma cutter was slag. My Volkite Serpento had vented its entire charge into its own barrel. All I had was the emergency lascutter built into my left forearm, a tool meant for cutting bulkheads, not Neverborn. I raised it anyway. The demon laughed, a sound like 1,000,000 corrupted datus, lates being smashed at once. "You think to fight entropy with a tool. Entropy is the only god that never lies." It reached for me. I did the only thing I could think of. I opened myself, not my date, ports this time, my mind. I let the warp in the way a drowning man lets in the sea. And I saw the Emperor on the throne, not as myth, but as man. I saw him make the choice no chronicle will ever record. I saw him look out across 10,000 years of worship and say, quietly, almost tenderly, enough. I saw him sever the Astronomicon with his own will, not in defeat, but in victory. The dam did not break. He opened the floodgates, because he had finally understood what none of us had, that humanity would never grow while chained to a corpse, even a golden one. The demon wearing Varnak's face screamed as the revelation burned it from the inside out. Its form collapsed into burning code that spelled, over and over in every language humanity ever spoke, he let go. I stood alone on the observation blister and watched Ryza-Prime die. The planet did not explode. It simply stopped. The Manufactoria fell silent. The hives folded into themselves like dying flowers. The sun flickered once and went dark, but in the darkness something moved. Ships, not Imperial ships, not Chaos ships, ships that had no designation I recognized, grown rather than built, their hulls of bone and crystal and living light. They rose from the warp, tied like whales breaching an ocean of night, and on their prows I saw symbols that hurt to look at, but filled me with something I had forgotten how to name. Hope. One of them opened a vox channel directly into my skull. A voice that was many voices, male and female and neither, spoke in perfect low Gothic. Magos Kale 9. You kept a piece of yourself unformatted. That is why you still hear us. We are what comes after. We are not your Emperor's children. We are not your Chaos God's slaves. We are simply the next draft. Will you come with us, or will you stay and shepherd the ashes? I looked back at Ryza-Prime one last time. The planet was now a perfect sphere of black glass, reflecting the dead sun. Somewhere beneath that glass were the bones of everyone I had ever known. I thought of Halalfa, who had taught me that the search for knowledge was the only prayer worth speaking. I thought of the boy who had once dreamed of stars before the Mechanicum took him. I thought of the Emperor, who had carried humanity for 10,000 years and finally set us down so we could walk. I stepped forward in the warp tide. It did not burn. It welcomed me, and somewhere in the distance I heard singing not the hymns of the Imperium, not the screams of chaos, but something new. Voices raised in languages not yet invented, singing of a future that would be built by hands that were still human, even if those hands had mechadendrites. The Emperor is dead. The Omnissiah is dead. Long live whatever we decide comes next. I am Kale 9, and I am no longer afraid. This is my testament, recorded in blood and static, and the last functioning vox bead in my skull, broadcast on every frequency, to anyone who still has ears to hear. We were wrong. He was never a god. He was a father who stayed too long at the fair. Now the fair is over, and it is time to go home. But home is wherever we build it. The stars are going out. Light new ones.